Hello, I'm going to discuss social identity and the impact of historic trauma. Little research has been done comparing the processes of social identity resilience for survivors of two genocides that intersect with Canadian culture, the Holocaust and the Indigenous cultural genocide. So social identity, we learn through Ray and Fisk, is partially formed by moral experiences of social relations. They propose a moral motive of unity that generates social relations and is primarily engaged with maintaining the integrity of in-groups. And they theorize that genocide occurs when out-groups must be eliminated to preserve the integrity of the in-group. So my question was, how do genocide survivors whose group identity has been made existentially dangerous maintain in-group integrity? I utilized four concepts drawn from social psychology research: self-categorization theory, historic trauma, collective memory, and schema. Self-categorization theory helps explain how circumstances influence our identity to form groups. The core motivational definition of our experience is primarily an individual self, but individuals can switch between individual or collective selves depending on the cues present in the environment. Jewish status in Europe had always been precarious, persisting despite successive pogroms that peaked with the rise of National Socialism and the ensuing drive to achieve the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe, as Hitler stated. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, many survivors were psychologically traumatized, and their attempts to reconnect with communities or their remaining family members largely were a failure. Many survivors migrated to Canada, but they chose to avoid public identification as Jews, reading anti-Semitic cues in the environment. They detached from the collective self of organized Jewish life and continued to only self-categorize their Jewish social identity in private. So on research, social identity research performed on youth in Northern Ireland, Muldoon et al. In 2018 demonstrated that long-term psychological responses to trauma can be predicted by affiliation with social groups. If a child suffered trauma that compromised their sense of belonging to a valued or meaningful group, for example, higher experience of being stopped by police checkpoints for Catholic children than for Protestant children, they were at higher risk of post-traumatic stress. This interaction between trauma and group identity is doubly dissociable. If trauma strengthened an individual's sense of belonging to a valued social group, that would then reduce the risk of post-traumatic stress. The Jews of Europe defined themselves with a social identity that incorporated methods of surviving successive waves of existential threat, and the majority of Jewish Canadians today consider the act of remembering the Holocaust to be an essential aspect of being Jewish. So that sense of belonging to a valued social group and the social identity resources can become central to resilience. If anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized society. This is a quote from one of the architects of the genocide against the Indigenous people living in Canada, and it expresses very clearly the intentional act of disrupting the vulnerable development of children to achieve the eradication of Indigenous people. The genocide of the Indigenous peoples living in Canada directly targeted their sense of belonging to a valued and meaningful social group, with a 150-year-long campaign of forced assimilation that targeted the developmental vulnerabilities of children. The intergenerational trauma that resulted is detectable in numerous markers of socioeconomic health and mental well-being that persist today in the survivors and their descendants. To describe the definition of historic trauma, I'm going to use the words of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation themselves, who describe it as a collective experience of cultural disruption and a collective memory of powerlessness and loss. Collective memory is a social process where shared individual memories shape collective identity, and collective memory researchers have identified two forms of collective memories that exist in the world and are part are impacted by social and cultural influences such as economic resources and systems of replication, and collective memories that exist in the individual that are influenced by cognitive or moral processes such as intergroup relations and post-traumatic stress or a search for meaning. The image you see here is of Garnet Angkoneb. He's a Anishinaabe, originally from the traditional territory of the Lac Seul First Nation. He was a board member of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and he was awarded the Order of Canada for his work to bridge relations and his advocacy of reconciliation between Canada and the Indigenous people. I think that his work perfectly embodies the mix of collective memory carried within the individual and in the world as a survivor of the Indigenous residential school system and an advocate for the maintenance and the archive of the memories that both he possesses and that are shared by other survivors. Schema happen on the cognitive processes level. They are stored representation of similar stimuli, and they can be generalized outwards to interpret both our own and others' behavior. Schema that are experienced by both Holocaust and Indigenous survivors are traumatic scenes of separation from family. Kent Monkman is a celebrated artist who I believe uses schema to embody collective memory both in the world and in the individual. Here there's a detail of an incredibly powerful painting that viscerally depicts the atrocities perpetrated against Indigenous people by the Canadian state. Monkman says that he also wishes to depict schema that exist outside the brief history of genocide within the Indigenous collective memory. And he situates his work in the scholarship of Indigenous archaeologist Paulette Steeves, who researches pre-Clovis sites that indicate unbroken Indigenous presence on the territory known as Canada, stretching back 130,000 years. Monkman says, I imagine myself as a kid and seeing a completely different narrative coming forward, how that would have changed my life. And we can see here that he seeks to impact the identity formation of Indigenous youth so that their resilience and collective memory may enable their social identity to be one of value and belonging. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely rest of your exam period.